courtroom doors swung open on a January morning in 1975, and every head turned toward the woman in the threadbare coat, clutching a child's hand. This is the story of how a single piece of paper changed 2 lives forever. The Sedgwick County Courthouse smelled like floor wax and old radiator steam, with wooden benches that creaked under the weight of spectators who'd come to watch the morning eviction docket. Kansas winter light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn marble floors. Margaret Holloway walked down that center aisle with her 6-year-old son, Danny, whose scuffed shoes squeaked with each nervous step. She wore her only good dress under a coat with missing buttons, her hands trembling as she gripped a manila folder that held everything she had left. Judge Theodore Brennan presided from the bench, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. He'd seen 200 eviction cases that winter alone, families drowning in medical bills, widows struggling on fixed incomes, men who'd lost factory jobs and couldn't catch up. By 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, his face had already settled into the practiced neutrality of someone who'd learned to separate compassion from duty. Case number 75-023, the clerk called out. Landlord Investments, LLC versus Margaret Holloway. Margaret stood, her legs unsteady. Danny stayed glued to her side, one small hand wrapped around 2 fingers of her left hand. The lawyer representing the landlord, a man in a crisp suit who'd already won 4 cases that morning, laid out the facts with mechanical efficiency. 3 months behind on rent. Total owed $473. Multiple warnings issued. No payment plan proposed. Mrs. Holloway, Judge Brennan said, his voice neither warm nor cold. Do you have legal representation? No, Your Honor. Her voice was barely above a whisper. And do you dispute the amount owed? No, Your Honor. I don't dispute it. She swallowed hard. I need more time. I'm working 2 jobs now, and I can pay. I just need... Mrs. Holloway, this court has heard similar requests in 23 cases this month alone. Without evidence of ability to pay or a concrete plan, I'm afraid... Please. The word came out broken. Margaret's composure cracked. Please, Your Honor. My husband died 11 months ago, Michael Holloway. He was a Marine. He came home from Vietnam and he really tried, but he couldn't... Her voice caught. He couldn't sleep, couldn't work steady. The VA said it would take months to process his benefits claim, and then She couldn't finish. Danny pressed closer to her leg, his face buried against her hip. Judge Brennan removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. He'd heard variations of this story dozens of times. Good men broken by war, families left behind to pick up pieces that could never quite fit back together. Mrs. Holloway, I understand your situation is difficult, but this court cannot... Danny has something for you. Margaret interrupted, her desperation overriding courtroom protocol. She knelt beside her son, whispering something in his ear. The boy stepped forward, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. His hand shook as he held it up toward the bench. The bailiff moved to intercept, but Judge Brennan waved him off. Bring it here. Danny approached the bench on legs that barely held him. He was small for 6, with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes. The judge leaned down, accepting the paper from the child's outstretched hand. It was a crayon drawing, crude and simple the way all children's art is, showing 2 stick figures, one tall and one small, standing under a smiling sun. Across the top, in a woman's careful handwriting over the boy's shaky letters, were the words, "Thank you, Judge Brennan, for saving my daddy in court." Theodore Brennan stared at the drawing. His hand began to shake. What? His voice came out hoarse. "What is this?" Margaret stood, her fingers knotted together. "You probably don't remember, Your Honor. It was 1968. My husband Michael was arrested for disorderly conduct. He got into a fight outside a bar in Wichita. He'd just come home from his first tour. He was so angry all the time, drinking too much. And when those men said those things about the war, about soldiers, he just..." She took a shaky breath. "You were the judge. You looked at his military record, his service, and you suspended his sentence. Ordered him into a veterans program instead of jail. You told him he'd served his country with honor and deserved a chance to heal." The courtroom had gone completely silent. Judge Brennan's eyes moved from the drawing to the woman, then down to the small boy standing before his bench. "Michael Holloway," he whispered. "He talked about you, Your Honor, for years. Said you were the first person who treated him like he mattered after he came home. Said you saw him as more than just another drunk vet." Margaret's voice broke. "He held on to that. Even when things got bad. Even when the nightmares made him..." She stopped, steadying herself. "Before he died, he told Danny about you. About the judge who gave him a second chance." Theodore Brennan set the drawing down on his bench with trembling hands. What happened next would become courthouse legend for the next 50 years. But the truth was far more complicated than anyone in that room could have imagined. Because Judge Brennan hadn't saved Michael Holloway at all. He'd failed him. Before we continue with what happened in that courtroom, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below, and if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these powerful, true stories. Judge Theodore Brennan looked down at the crayon drawing and felt 7 years of carefully maintained composure begin to crumble. The weight of what Margaret Holloway didn't know was crushing. The courtroom remained frozen in that strange, suspended moment when everyone senses something profound is happening, but can't yet name it. The landlord's attorney shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his watch. The court reporter's fingers hovered motionless above her keys. Margaret stood with one hand resting protectively on Danny's shoulder, hope and fear warring across her face. Judge Brennan cleared his throat twice before he could speak. "Mrs. Holloway, I need..." He stopped, started again. "I need to call a recess. 30 minutes. Please wait in the hallway." "Your Honor, I have 4 more cases on the docket," the landlord's attorney protested. 30 minutes, Brennan repeated, his voice carrying an edge that made the lawyer fall silent immediately. "This court is in recess." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the vaulted ceiling. Margaret gathered Danny close, confused but obedient, and filed out with the other spectators. The judge remained seated until the room emptied, then rose on unsteady legs and retreated to his chambers. His secretary, Helen, who'd worked for him for 18 years, took one look at his face and quietly closed the door behind him. Theodore Brennan sank into the leather chair behind his desk and pressed both palms flat against the dark wood surface, trying to anchor himself. The crayon drawing lay before him, that innocent sun beaming down on 2 stick figures, a father and son who should have had a lifetime together. He did remember the case. God help him, he remembered. 1968, July. The courtroom had been stifling that summer day, before the courthouse got air conditioning. Michael Holloway had stood before the bench in wrinkled civilian clothes that hung loose on his frame, his eyes hollow, his jaw set in that particular way combat veterans held themselves, ready for attack, even in peacetime. The police report detailed a bar fight. 3 men had made comments about baby killers and napalm, and Holloway had put 2 of them in the hospital. The prosecutor wanted 6 months in county jail, but Theodore Brennan had looked at Michael Holloway's service record: 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, 13 months in the Mekong Delta, and he'd seen something that haunted him. Not just another troubled veteran, but a young man who'd been 19 when he shipped out and 20 when he came back, fundamentally altered by what he'd witnessed and done. Brennan had suspended the sentence, yes, ordered Holloway into a veterans support program, given him what everyone in that courtroom believed was mercy. What no one knew, what Brennan had never told anyone, was what happened 3 weeks later. Michael Holloway had returned to court for his check-in hearing, as required by the suspended sentence, but he'd shown up drunk, belligerent, and when the bailiff tried to remove him, Holloway had swung at him. In the chaos that followed, Brennan had made a split-second decision. He'd had Holloway removed and filed away the violation without revoking his suspended sentence. He'd told himself it was compassion, giving the man another chance, but it was cowardice. Brennan had been up for re-election that year, and the local newspaper had already run 2 editorials criticizing judges who were soft on crime. He'd been afraid that if word got out about the violation, about his leniency being repaid with violence, it would cost him the bench. So he'd buried the paperwork, made the incident disappear, and told himself he was protecting Holloway's future. He never followed up. Never checked if Holloway had gotten the help he needed. Never asked if the veterans program was even working. He'd simply moved on to the next case, the next election, the next year. Now, sitting in his chambers with a child's drawing that thanked him for salvation he hadn't truly provided, Theodore Brennan understood the full scope of his failure. If he'd done his job properly, if he'd followed through, insisted on real treatment, pushed the VA to act faster, would Michael Holloway still be alive? Would that little boy in the courtroom still have a father? A knock at the door interrupted his spiral. "Ted?" Helen's voice came through, gentle but firm. "It's been 25 minutes." Brennan stood, straightening his robe with hands that still trembled slightly. He tucked the drawing carefully into his breast pocket, feeling its slight weight against his heart. When he returned to the courtroom, Margaret and Danny were seated in the front row. The boy was coloring on the back of an envelope with a stubby blue crayon, his legs swinging beneath the bench. Margaret's eyes were red-rimmed but dry, her spine straight with the desperate dignity of someone who's already survived the worst and is simply waiting for the next blow. Judge Brennan took his seat. The courtroom settled into attention. "Mrs. Holloway, would you approach the bench, please?" She stood, leaving Danny with a whispered instruction to stay put, and walked forward. Up close, Brennan could see the exhaustion carved into her face, the sleepless nights, the double shifts, the crushing weight of trying to be both mother and father to a grieving child while drowning in her own loss. "Mrs. Holloway," he began, his voice lower than usual, "I want you to know that I do remember your husband. I remember him very clearly." Margaret's breath caught. "You do?" "Yes. And I want you to know—" He had to pause, collecting himself. "I want you to know that what I did for him, it wasn't enough. I should have done more, I should have—" His voice cracked. "I'm deeply sorry for your loss. What happened next would determine whether redemption was even possible. But first, the courtroom needed to hear the truth about mercy and its terrible price." Theodore Brennan looked at Margaret Holloway and made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation he'd cultivated in 23 years on the bench. He was going to tell her the truth. "Mrs. Holloway, Before I rule on this case, there's something you need to understand about what really happened with your husband. His voice carried across the silent courtroom. Something I've never told anyone. Margaret's face paled. Your Honor, I don't understand. In July of 1968, I gave your husband a suspended sentence. I ordered him into treatment. Everyone believed I'd shown him mercy. Brennan removed his glasses, meeting her eyes directly. But 3 weeks later, Michael came back to this courthouse drunk and violent. He attacked a bailiff. By the terms of his suspended sentence, I should have sent him to jail immediately. Instead, I buried the violation. I made it disappear from the record. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The landlord's attorney sat forward, suddenly interested. Margaret gripped the edge of the judge's bench, her knuckles white. Why? She whispered. Why would you do that? Because I was afraid. The admission came out raw. I was up for re-election. I was worried about looking soft on crime, so I took what I told myself was the compassionate path. I gave him another chance without any real accountability, without ensuring he got proper help. And then I never followed up. I never checked on him. I just moved on. Brennan's hands shook as he placed them flat on the bench. Mrs. Holloway, your husband told you I saved him. And maybe in that moment I did. But I failed him when it mattered most. I gave him freedom without support, a second chance without structure. If I'd done my job properly, if I'd insisted on real treatment, pushed the VA, monitored his progress, maybe he'd still be here. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Margaret Holloway stood frozen, her face cycling through shock, confusion, anger, and finally something that looked almost like understanding. Behind her, Danny had stopped coloring and was watching his mother with wide, frightened eyes. You think, her voice cracked, you think you're responsible for Michael's death? I think I had a responsibility I didn't fulfill. Your Honor, with all due respect. Margaret's voice suddenly strengthened, carrying a fierce clarity that made several spectators lean forward. You don't get to carry that guilt. You don't get to own my husband's death. Brennan looked up, startled. Michael was sick. Margaret's eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. Not drunk sick or discipline sick. War sick. Soul sick. The kind of sick that came from watching his friends die in rice paddies and having to kill teenagers who looked like children. The kind that made him wake up screaming every night, convinced he was still in the jungle. The kind that no courthouse program or VA clinic was equipped to handle in 1968. She took a shaky breath. You gave him hope when he had none. You treated him like a human being when everyone else saw him as a problem to be locked away. Maybe you didn't do everything perfectly, but Your Honor, nobody could have. The system was broken. The war was still going. The help didn't exist yet. Mrs. Holloway, Michael died by his own hand last February, Margaret continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He walked out into a snowstorm without a coat and he didn't come back. The coroner ruled it accidental hypothermia, but we both knew. I knew. And Danny, her voice broke completely. Danny was the one who found him the next morning, frozen in the backyard, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. The courtroom had become a cathedral of grief. Judge Brennan felt something crack open in his chest. Not just guilt, but a deeper recognition of shared human failure, shared loss, shared responsibility for wounds that couldn't be healed by any single act of mercy. Your husband's death wasn't your fault, Margaret said, tears finally spilling over. And it wasn't mine either, though I've spent 11 months trying to convince myself otherwise. It was the war's fault. It was a broken system's fault. It was the fault of a country that sent boys to fight and then abandoned them when they came home different. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, composing herself with visible effort. But you know what wasn't the war's fault? The 5 years Michael got to spend with his son. The 1,000 bedtime stories he read. The way he taught Danny to tie his shoes and ride a bike and be kind to people who are hurting. Those years happened because of the chance you gave him. And every single day of those 5 years was a gift. A gift worth fighting for. Theodore Brennan looked down at the eviction paperwork on his desk, then back at the woman and child who represented both his failure and his chance at something resembling redemption. The legal requirements were clear. 3 months unpaid rent, no proposed payment plan, no evidence of ability to pay. By every measure of law and precedent, he should rule in favor of the landlord. But law wasn't the same as justice, and precedent had nothing to do with mercy. Mr. Patterson, Brennan addressed the landlord's attorney, his voice regaining its judicial authority. Does your client own other rental properties in Sedgwick County? The attorney consulted his file. Yes, Your Honor. Landlord Investments LLC owns 43 residential properties. And how many eviction cases has your client filed in the past 12 months? I'd have to check the exact 37, Brennan said flatly. I've presided over 11 of them personally. Your client has a pattern of renting to vulnerable tenants, waiting for them to fall behind, and then using the legal system to cycle them out in favor of higher-paying renters. He leaned forward. Tell your client that this court is denying the eviction petition. Mrs. Holloway is granted a 6-month grace period to bring her account current, and rent is frozen at her current rate for the duration. Patterson shot to his feet. Your Honor, that's completely... Furthermore, I'm ordering an audit of all Landlord Investments properties to ensure compliance with Kansas housing codes. I suspect we'll find multiple violations that will cost your client considerably more than $473. The attorney's face went red, but he knew better than to argue further. He gathered his papers with sharp, angry movements. Margaret Holloway stood motionless, tears streaming down her face. Your Honor, I can't. You can, and you will, Brennan said gently. And Mrs. Holloway, I want you and Danny to come back here in 6 months. Not for a court case, just to visit. I'd like to know how you're both doing. Danny had climbed down from the bench and run to his mother, wrapping his arms around her waist. Margaret sank down, pulling him close, both of them shaking with relief and grief and exhaustion. But the story wasn't over, because in the back of the courtroom, a man in a pressed suit had been watching the entire proceeding with great interest, and he had very specific plans for what he'd just witnessed. The man in the pressed suit waited until the courtroom emptied before approaching the bench. Sometimes mercy creates as many problems as it solves. His name was Robert Caldwell, and he was a reporter for the Wichita Eagle. He'd been covering the eviction docket for a series on housing inequality in Kansas, expecting routine legal proceedings and dry statistics. What he'd witnessed instead was something far more compelling, a judge openly admitting to judicial misconduct, then ruling against legal precedent in what could only be described as an emotional decision. It was either a beautiful story about human redemption or a scandal waiting to explode. Caldwell suspected it was both. Judge Brennan, he called out as Theodore gathered his papers. Robert Caldwell, Wichita Eagle. Could I have a moment? Brennan looked up, and the weariness in his face deepened. He'd forgotten about the reporters who occasionally sat in on the eviction dockets. Mr. Caldwell, I'm not in the habit of discussing my rulings with the press. Even when those rulings involve confessing to falsifying court records in 1968? The judge's jaw tightened. What I said in that courtroom was between me and Mrs. Holloway. With all due respect, Your Honor, you said it in open court. That makes it public record. Caldwell moved closer, his notepad already out. The public has a right to know if a sitting judge deliberately concealed a probation violation. They have a right to know if judicial decisions are being made based on emotion rather than law. Brennan descended from the bench, his black robe suddenly feeling like a weight rather than authority. Mr. Caldwell, you're right that I spoke in open court. But before you decide to make this a headline, I'd ask you to consider what purpose it would serve. Would exposing what I did 23 years ago help anyone? Or would it simply destroy whatever good might come from today's ruling? That's not for me to decide, Your Honor. My job is to report the facts. Then report all of them. Brennan's voice gained strength. Report that the VA failed thousands of veterans. Report that men came home from Vietnam with wounds we had no idea how to treat. Report that a widow and her 6-year-old son were about to lose their home because a landlord views human beings as inventory to be cycled for profit. He paused. And yes, report that a judge made a mistake 23 years ago and has been carrying the weight of it ever since. Caldwell studied him for a long moment. You know what will happen if I write this story? The Kansas Judicial Review Board will have to investigate. You could be censured, possibly removed from the bench. I know. And you're willing to accept that? Mr. Caldwell, I stood up there today and watched a woman forgive me for something I can't forgive myself for. The least I can do is face the consequences of my actions. Brennan straightened his shoulders. Write your story. Do your job, but do it honestly. The reporter nodded slowly, tucking his notepad away. For what it's worth, Judge, I think what you did today took more courage than most people have. Or more cowardice. I'm still not sure which. 3 blocks away, Margaret Holloway sat in a corner booth at Betty's Diner with Danny, a plate of untouched pie between them. The diner smelled like coffee and bacon grease, with red vinyl seats that squeaked when you moved, and a jukebox in the corner playing Roberta Flack. The lunch rush had passed, leaving only a handful of other customers. A truck driver reading a newspaper, 2 elderly women sharing a pot of tea, a waitress named Doris who'd been pouring coffee in this place since 1958. Mama, can we really stay in our house? Danny asked, swirling his spoon through melted ice cream. Yes, baby. For now we can stay. Because of the judge? Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him. He had Michael's dark hair and serious eyes, but there was something of her own stubborn optimism in the set of his jaw. At 6 years old, he'd already experienced more loss than many adults. He'd found his father's body in the snow. He'd watched their savings evaporate into medical bills and funeral costs. He'd heard his mother cry through too many nights when she thought he was asleep. But he'd also learned to draw thank you pictures for strangers who'd shown kindness years before he was born. Because of the judge, Margaret confirmed, and because your daddy did something very brave a long time ago. He asked for help when he needed it. Daddy was brave? The bravest man I ever knew. It wasn't entirely true. Michael had been many things, some of them frightening, especially near the end. But it was the truth Danny needed. Children deserved to know their parents as heroes, even flawed ones, especially flawed ones. Doris refilled Margaret's coffee without being asked, her weathered face kind. Heard you had a good day in court, honey. Margaret looked up, surprised. How did you? Judge Brennan's secretary Helen is my sister-in-law. She called me 15 minutes ago. Doris smiled. Said we should make sure you and your boy got a proper meal today. This one's on the house. I can't let you. Yes, you can. Doris patted her shoulder. This town takes care of its own, Margaret. We should have been doing it better all along. After Doris walked away, Margaret felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not just relief, but something bigger. A sense that maybe the world still had enough good people in it to balance out the darkness. Maybe mercy wasn't a weakness. Maybe forgiveness wasn't surrender. Maybe there was still a way forward. Danny had returned to his drawing, his blue crayon moving across a napkin in careful loops. Margaret watched him work, this small person who'd become her entire reason for continuing when everything else fell apart. What are you drawing, sweetheart? A picture for the judge, for when we visit in 6 months. He held it up, another stick figure scene, this time showing 3 people. A woman, a child, and a tall man in a black robe, all holding hands under that same smiling sun. Margaret's throat tightened. That's beautiful, Danny. Do you think Daddy can see us from heaven? The question hit her like a fist. She wanted to say yes, wanted to give him the comfort of certainty. But Margaret Holloway had stopped believing in easy answers the morning she found her husband frozen in the backyard, his eyes open and empty, his lips blue. I think, she chose her words carefully, I think if love is strong enough, it finds a way to stay with us, maybe not in the way we want, but somehow. Your daddy loved you more than anything in this world, Danny. That love doesn't just disappear. Love doesn't disappear. It was a prayer more than a statement, a hope against evidence, the kind of thing you say when you need it to be true more than you need it to be certain. Outside Betty's diner, the January afternoon was turning toward dusk. Streetlights flickered on along Douglas Avenue. Cars passed by with their headlights cutting through the gathering dark. Somewhere in the city, Robert Caldwell was typing up his notes, deciding what kind of story to tell. Somewhere else, Judge Theodore Brennan sat in his chambers, staring at a child's crayon drawing and wondering if redemption was even possible. And in a corner booth with cracked vinyl and lukewarm coffee, a widow and her son were learning the first lesson of survival. That sometimes mercy comes from unexpected places, and grace arrives in the form of strangers who choose to care when they could just as easily look away. But the real test was still coming, because mercy always has a price, and someone always has to pay it. The story ran on the front page of the Wichita Eagle 3 days later, above the fold, with a headline that made Theodore Brennan's stomach drop. Judge admits covering up court violation, then rules against landlord in emotional case. The truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it burns everything down. Robert Caldwell had written the piece with more nuance than Brennan expected, but the damage was done. By noon, the courthouse switchboard was flooded with calls. By evening, 2 television news crews had set up outside the building. By the next morning, the Kansas Judicial Review Board had formally announced an investigation into Judge Theodore Brennan's conduct, both past and present. Helen found him in his chambers on the 3rd day after the article ran, staring out the window at the news vans below. She'd worked for him long enough to know when silence was better than comfort, so she simply set a fresh cup of coffee on his desk and waited. I've drafted my resignation letter, Brennan said finally, not turning from the window. I'll submit it this afternoon. That's a coward's way out, Ted. He turned, surprised by the steel in her voice. Helen was 59, a grandmother of 4, a woman who'd typed 1,000 rulings without ever questioning his judgment. She'd never spoken to him this way, A coward's way? You made a mistake 23 years ago. You owned it publicly. You made a ruling based on compassion and justice instead of cold precedent. Helen crossed her arms. And now you want to quit because it got difficult? What about the next Margaret Holloway who walks into that courtroom? What about the next veteran who needs someone to see them as human? Helen, I falsified court records. You showed mercy to a broken young man, and you've spent 2 decades wondering if you did enough. That's not corruption, Ted. That's conscience. She moved closer. The people calling for your head? Half of them never spent a day worrying about what happens to families after the gavel comes down. They want rules without exceptions, law without humanity. Is that the kind of justice system you want to leave behind? Brennan sank into his chair. What if they're right? What if my judgment can't be trusted? Then every ruling you've made in 23 years is suspect. Every family you've kept together. Every defendant you've given a second chance. Every kid you've steered toward rehabilitation instead of prison. All of it tainted. Helen's voice softened. Or maybe, just maybe, your willingness to carry the weight of difficult decisions is exactly what makes you a good judge. Before Brennan could respond, his phone rang. Helen answered it, listened for a moment, then held out the receiver. It's Margaret Holloway. His hand shook slightly as he took the phone. Mrs. Holloway? Judge Brennan. Her voice was tight with controlled emotion. I just saw the newspaper. I need you to know, this isn't what I wanted. I never meant for Mrs. Holloway, you did nothing wrong. I spoke those words in open court. The consequences are mine to bear. But people are saying, she took a shaky breath. They're saying you made a corrupt ruling, that you gave me special treatment because you felt guilty. Some are saying I manipulated you with Danny's drawing. Brennan's jaw tightened. He'd expected the criticism to fall on him, but somehow he'd been naive enough to think Margaret would be spared. What people say doesn't change the truth. My ruling was legally sound, even if unconventional. Judge, there's something else. Margaret's voice dropped. My landlord's attorney called this morning. He's filing an appeal, and he's threatening to sue me personally for defamation, claiming I accused his client of exploitation in court. That's absurd. You made no such accusation. I know. But he said... She paused, and Brennan could hear Danny's voice in the background, asking a question. He said that if I don't drop my opposition to the eviction and move out voluntarily, he'll drag this through court for years. He said the publicity alone will make it impossible for me to rent anywhere else in Wichita. The price of mercy kept rising. Brennan closed his eyes. This was how the system crushed people. Not through direct cruelty, but through the grinding weight of endless legal maneuvering that only the wealthy could afford to sustain. Margaret had won her case, but the victory was already being transformed into a new kind of trap. Mrs. Holloway, don't make any decisions yet. Let me... Your Honor, I can't let you sacrifice your career for me. I've been thinking, maybe it's better if I just move out. Find something smaller, somewhere cheaper. At least then this all stops. No. The word came out harder than he intended. Margaret. May I call you Margaret? Yes, of course. Margaret, what you said in that courtroom was true. The system is broken. Powerful people exploit vulnerable ones because they can, because the law allows it, because good people stay silent. If you give up now, if I resign now, we're just proving that speaking truth has consequences too painful to bear. Is that the lesson you want your son to learn? The line was quiet for a long moment. When Margaret spoke again, her voice was steadier. What do you suggest we do? We fight. Properly this time. I know a lawyer, Sarah Chen. She does housing advocacy work. She takes cases pro bono when she believes in them. Let me call her. I can't afford. You won't need to. Sarah doesn't do this for money. She does it because... Brennan paused, remembering. Her father was a veteran too. Korean War. He came home to find all his property had been sold off by a business partner who exploited his absence. She grew up watching him try to get justice through a system designed to protect people with power. Margaret was quiet, processing. And you think she'll help me? I know she will. Let me make the call. After they hung up, Brennan sat for a long moment with his hand still on the receiver. Helen was watching him with an expression that might have been approval, or worry, or both. You're not resigning, she observed. I'm not resigning. Good. Because Ted Brennan may have made mistakes, but he's the best judge this courthouse has, and everyone knows it. Even the ones calling for your head. That evening, Sarah Chen sat across from Margaret Holloway in the same corner booth at Betty's Diner, where Margaret had celebrated her court victory just days before. Sarah was 34, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, with a reputation for taking on impossible cases and winning through sheer, relentless preparation. Judge Brennan explained your situation, Sarah said, spreading papers across the table. And he was right. You have a strong case. But you need to understand what you're up against. Danny was coloring again at the far end of the booth, humming quietly to himself. Margaret kept one eye on him while she listened. Landlord Investments LLC is owned by a shell company, which is owned by another shell company. But I did some digging. The ultimate owner is Marcus Patterson, the same attorney who represented them in court. He's been running this scheme for 5 years. Buy cheap properties, rent to vulnerable tenants, evict them the moment they stumble, raise the rent, repeat. He's made over $300,000 doing it. Margaret felt sick. That's legal? Technically, yes. Morally, it's predatory. And the beauty of Judge Brennan's ruling is that it opens up an avenue we haven't had before. The housing code audit he ordered. I guarantee Patterson's properties are full of violations. Faulty wiring, mold, inadequate heating. Things he's been ignoring while collecting rent checks. So what do we do? Sarah smiled, and there was something fierce in it. We make him wish he'd never filed that first eviction notice. We document every violation in every property. We file a class action lawsuit on behalf of every tenant he's exploited. And we make sure that when this is over, Marcus Patterson's name is synonymous with slumlord corruption. That sounds... Margaret hesitated. That sounds like war. It is war. The question is whether you're willing to fight it. Margaret looked at Danny, still lost in his innocent world of crayons and paper. She thought about Michael, who'd fought a war overseas only to come home and wage a different kind of battle. Against his own mind, against a system that didn't understand him, against demons no one else could see. He'd lost that fight, but maybe she didn't have to lose hers. What do you need from me? Margaret asked. Your story. Every detail of what you've experienced as Patterson's tenant. And I'll need you to help me find other tenants who've been through the same thing. Justice demands witnesses. Margaret straightened her shoulders, feeling something shift inside her. The transformation from victim to fighter, from someone who things happened to into someone who made things happen. Then let's get to work. But neither of them knew that Marcus Patterson had already made his own calculations and decided that if he was going to lose, he'd make sure everyone else lost more. The call came at 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday in late January, yanking Theodore Brennan from uneasy sleep. Sometimes evil doesn't hide in shadows. It announces itself in flames. Judge Brennan? The voice on the line was rough, official. This is Captain Miller with the Wichita Fire Department. There's been a fire at 617 Oak Street. The tenant, Margaret Holloway, listed you as an emergency contact. Brennan was already pulling on clothes, his heart hammering. Is she hurt? The boy. Is the boy all right? They're both safe. Smoke inhalation, some minor burns. They're at Wesley Medical Center now. But Judge, there's something you should know. The fire marshal is already calling this arson. 20 minutes later, Brennan pushed through the emergency room doors to find Margaret sitting on an exam table with an oxygen mask. Danny curled against her side with his face buried in her shoulder. Both of them were covered in soot, their clothes reeking of smoke. A nurse was bandaging Margaret's left hand where she'd burned it breaking through a window. Margaret! Brennan's voice cracked as he approached. She looked up, and the exhaustion in her eyes was bottomless. They tried to kill us. What happened? I woke up to Danny screaming. The whole back of the house was on fire. The bedroom, the hallway. Someone had poured accelerant around the exterior walls. The fire marshal found empty gasoline cans in the alley. Her voice was flat, shock turning everything distant. If Danny hadn't woken up when he did, if I hadn't gotten us out through the front room window, she couldn't finish. Danny whimpered against her, and she held him tighter. Brennan felt rage building in his chest, white hot and righteous. Do the police know? They're investigating, but Judge... Margaret met his eyes. We both know who did this. We both know it was Patterson. You can't make that accusation without proof. I don't need proof to know the truth. Her voice gained strength through the shock. 3 days ago, Sarah Chen filed the class action lawsuit. Yesterday, Patterson's properties failed the housing code inspection. 27 violations across 6 buildings. This morning, I was served with a countersuit claiming I organized a conspiracy to defame him. And tonight, someone tried to burn me and my son alive. She was right, and they both knew it. But knowing and proving were different things, and the law demanded proof. Sarah Chen arrived 40 minutes later, still in her bathrobe under a winter coat, her face grim. She took one look at Margaret and Danny and turned to Brennan. Tell me you're thinking what I'm thinking. That we're dealing with someone who's willing to commit murder to protect his income stream? Yes. The fire marshal confirmed accelerants. The police are treating it as attempted murder and arson, but without witnesses or physical evidence linking Patterson. Then we find evidence. Margaret's voice cut through their strategizing. Both lawyers turned to look at her. I'm not running. I'm not backing down. And I'm not letting that man get away with this. Margaret, you and Danny need protection, Sarah said gently. We need to find you somewhere safe to stay while... No. Margaret stood, despite the nurse's protests, Danny still clinging to her. You know what happens if I disappear now? Patterson wins. He gets to paint me as unstable, as a liar who set her own house on fire for sympathy. He gets to bury the lawsuit in my absence and go right back to exploiting people. Better alive and accused than dead and vindicated, Brennan said quietly. Margaret's laugh was bitter. Your Honor, I've been dead for 11 months. Ever since I found Michael in the snow. I've been going through the motions, pretending there was still something worth living for. She looked down at Danny, smoothing his soot-stained hair. But that courtroom last week, when you gave us another chance, that was the first time I felt alive again. The first time I thought maybe the world still had room for people like us. She set Danny gently on the exam table and faced them both. I will not let Marcus Patterson steal that from me. I will not teach my son that evil wins when good people are too scared to fight back. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Sarah exchanged a look with Brennan. They were watching someone transform in real time. Grief and terror alchemizing into something harder, something unbreakable. "All right," Sarah said finally. "But we do this smart. We get you and Danny somewhere Patterson can't find you. We build the case piece by piece, and we make sure that when we move against him, it's checkmate." "Where can we go that's safe?" Margaret asked. Brennan spoke before he could second-guess himself. "My house. I have a spare room, security, and I guarantee Patterson won't try anything against a sitting judge's home. Even if he's desperate, he's not stupid enough for that. Judge Brennan, I can't impose—" "You're not imposing. You're accepting help." He softened his tone. "Margaret, you stood in my courtroom and forgave me for failures I've carried for 23 years. The least I can do is offer you a safe place to stay while we end this." The house on Maple Street was modest but solid, a 2-story craftsman with a wide front porch and a maple tree in the yard that had given the street its name back in 1920. Brennan had lived there alone since his wife died 6 years earlier. The room's too big for one person, but too full of memories to leave. He set Margaret and Danny up in the guest room, his daughter's old room actually, with wallpaper patterned in tiny blue flowers and a window that looked out over the backyard. Danny was asleep within minutes, exhausted by trauma and smoke inhalation. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, stroking her son's hair, unable to look away from him. "Coffee?" Brennan offered from the doorway. She nodded, following him downstairs to the kitchen. The house was quiet in that particular way houses are in the deep hours of night, when every creak and settling sound seems amplified. Brennan put on a pot of coffee and pulled out 2 mugs from a cabinet. "My daughter used to have nightmares," he said, pouring. "After my wife died, she'd wake up screaming, convinced the house was on fire or collapsing. The therapist said it was her mind trying to process loss, turning it into something concrete, something she could escape from." "How did you help her?" "I didn't really. I just stayed close, reminded her she wasn't alone." He handed Margaret her coffee. "She's in California now, married with 2 kids of her own. We talk every Sunday. She's happy." "That must be nice, knowing your child is happy." Brennan heard the weight in those words, the unspoken fear that Danny would never be happy again, that tonight's trauma was just one more scar on top of too many others. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." He sat across from her at the kitchen table. "When I ruled in your favor last week, part of me did it out of guilt, out of a need to feel like I'd finally done something right after failing your husband. But that's not why I'm helping you now." She looked up, waiting. "I'm helping you now because what you said in that courtroom was true. The system is broken, and the only way to fix broken systems is for good people to stand up when it costs them something. You're doing that. You're risking everything to prove that people like Patterson can't just crush whoever they want with impunity." "I'm terrified," Margaret admitted, her voice small. "I know. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it." They sat in the warm kitchen, 2 people bound by tragedy and circumstance, drinking coffee and watching the darkness outside slowly yield to the first gray hints of dawn. Somewhere in the city, Marcus Patterson was probably sleeping soundly, confident that fear would do what threats and legal maneuvering couldn't. He had no idea what he'd unleashed. because Margaret Holloway had already survived the worst thing that could happen to her, and that made her dangerous in ways Patterson couldn't comprehend. The real battle was about to begin, and this time, mercy would come with teeth. Sarah Chen stood before the assembled press conference with evidence that would destroy a man's empire, and she intended to use every page of it. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice delivered is unstoppable. The Sedgwick County courthouse steps were crowded with reporters on a cold February morning, cameras jostling for position, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Sarah had called the press conference for 9 o'clock, timing it perfectly to catch the morning news cycle and the afternoon papers. Behind her stood Margaret Holloway, Danny holding her hand, and Judge Theodore Brennan, not in his robes, but in a simple suit, present as a citizen rather than an officer of the court. 3 weeks ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying across the crowd. A landlord tried to evict a widow and her 6-year-old son for being 3 months behind on rent. That eviction was denied by Judge Brennan, who recognized it for what it was: predatory exploitation of vulnerable people. What happened next should concern every person in this city. She held up a thick folder. This is evidence of a systematic pattern of abuse spanning 5 years. Marcus Patterson, operating through Landlord Investments LLC, has filed 93 eviction cases in Sedgwick County. 87 resulted in successful evictions. Of those 87 families displaced, 72 were single mothers, veterans, or elderly persons on fixed incomes. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes. But the story doesn't end with evictions. The housing code inspection ordered by Judge Brennan revealed 27 serious violations across Patterson's properties: faulty wiring, black mold, inadequate heating systems, broken smoke detectors. These conditions weren't accidents. They were cost-cutting measures that put tenants' lives at risk while Patterson collected rent checks. Sarah's voice hardened. And when Margaret Holloway fought back, when she dared to stand up for herself and other tenants, someone set fire to her home at 2:30 in the morning while she and her son slept inside. The fire marshal's report confirms arson. Someone tried to murder a woman and child to silence them. A murmur ran through the crowd. Margaret's hand tightened on Danny's shoulder. Today, we're filing criminal complaints against Marcus Patterson for arson, attempted murder, fraud, and a pattern of housing code violations amounting to criminal negligence. We're also announcing a class action lawsuit on behalf of 147 current and former tenants who were exploited by his practices. A reporter called out, "Do you have direct evidence linking Patterson to the arson?" Sarah smiled thinly. "We have something better. We have his mistake." She nodded to an assistant, who wheeled out a television on a cart. On the screen appeared security camera footage, grainy and time-stamped at 2:15 a.m. on the night of the fire. This footage comes from a convenience store 3 blocks from Margaret's house. Watch the vehicle pulling up to the pump. The crowd leaned forward. A black SUV appeared on screen, and a man got out, face clearly visible under the fluorescent lights as he prepaid for gas with cash. That's Marcus Patterson. At 2:15 a.m., purchasing 10 gallons of gasoline, paying cash, 3 blocks from a house that would be set on fire 15 minutes later. Sarah paused. The gasoline cans found at the scene matched the brand sold at this station. Patterson's fingerprints are on file from his law license application. The fire marshal is currently comparing them to prints lifted from one of the recovered cans. The trap had closed. The press conference erupted in shouted questions, but Sarah raised her hand. Margaret Holloway would like to say something. Margaret stepped forward, and the crowd quieted. She looked smaller than she had in the courtroom 3 weeks ago. The fire had taken something from her, carved away another layer of the person she used to be. But her voice was steady. My husband Michael served his country in Vietnam. He came home broken, and the system failed him. When he died, I thought I'd lost everything. My partner, my security, my hope for the future. She looked down at Danny. But then I realized I still had my son, and I still had my dignity. Marcus Patterson tried to take both. He failed. She raised her eyes to the cameras. This isn't just about me. This is about every person who's been told they don't matter because they're poor, or grieving, or just trying to survive. This is about saying that the law is supposed to protect all of us, not just the people with power and money. Margaret's voice grew stronger. Michael used to tell me that the hardest battles aren't fought with guns, but with courage. The courage to stand up when it's easier to stay silent, to fight when it's safer to run. I didn't understand what he meant until now. She turned to Judge Brennan. Your Honor, you gave me a chance when you could have just followed the rules and made me disappear into the statistics. You taught me that the system only works when good people choose to make it work, even when it costs them something. Thank you. Brennan's eyes were wet, but his voice was firm when he spoke. Mrs. Holloway, you're the one who taught me. You reminded me that justice without mercy is just tyranny with a gavel. The trial took 4 months to wind through the legal system, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Patterson's fingerprints matched those on the gasoline cans. Security footage placed him at the scene. A former employee came forward, testifying that Patterson had asked him to take care of the Holloway problem and had offered $5,000, an offer the employee had refused and immediately reported to police. In the end, Marcus Patterson was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison for arson, attempted murder, fraud, and racketeering. His properties were seized and sold, with proceeds going to compensate the tenants he'd exploited. The class action lawsuit resulted in a settlement that gave Margaret and 96 other families enough money to start over with dignity. But the most important change happened quietly, in committee rooms and legislative chambers where such things are decided. The Holloway Act, sponsored by a state senator who'd read about the case, reformed Kansas housing law, creating stronger protections for tenants and harsher penalties for predatory landlords. On a warm day in June, 6 months after that first courtroom appearance, Margaret and Danny returned to Judge Brennan's chambers. Not for a court case, as promised, but for a visit. Look how tall you've gotten, Brennan said, shaking Danny's hand with mock formality. The boy grinned, proud to be treated like a grown-up. Danny starts first grade in the fall, Margaret said. We found a good school district. Small apartment, but it's ours. Really ours this time, with a lease that's actually fair. And you? How are you doing? Margaret considered the question honestly. Some days are harder than others. I still miss Michael. Danny still has nightmares sometimes, but we're healing. Slowly, but healing. She reached into her bag and pulled out a frame. Danny made this for you, for your office. It was the drawing from that first day in court. The stick figures under the smiling sun, thanked for saving Danny's daddy. But Danny had added to it. Now there were more figures. A woman, a child, and a man in a black robe, all holding hands. Across the top, in careful letters that showed months of practice, Danny had written, "Thank you for saving my mom too." Theodore Brennan accepted the drawing with shaking hands, and this time he didn't try to hide his tears. "You know," he said after a moment, "I've been on the bench for 23 years. I've ruled on thousands of cases. But I think this case that started with a crayon drawing and ended with systemic reform, this might be the only one that actually mattered. It mattered, Margaret confirmed. To me, to Danny, to every family that won't be exploited because someone finally stood up and said enough. Enough. The word echoed in the chambers, in the courthouse, in the lives of everyone who'd been part of this story. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the world. One person saying enough, and another person choosing to listen. As Margaret and Danny left the courthouse that afternoon, walking hand in hand into the summer sunshine, they passed a plaque being installed in the main lobby. It commemorated the passage of the Holloway Act, and it bore a simple inscription: "Justice is not a destination, but a journey we take together. One act of courage at a time." Michael Holloway's name was listed there too. Not as a victim, but as a veteran whose sacrifice had inspired change long after his death. And somewhere, in whatever place the dead go to watch over the living, perhaps Michael saw his son walking in sunshine with his mother, safe and loved and whole, and finally found the peace that had eluded him in life. 20 years later, a young law student stood in the Sedgwick County Courthouse, reading the brass plaque in the lobby, tracing the letters of the Holloway Act with her fingertips. Some stories don't end. They echo forward through generations. Her name was Rose Chen, and she was writing her thesis on transformative justice in American housing law. The Holloway case had become legendary in legal circles, a perfect storm of judicial courage, citizen activism, and systemic reform that law professors still taught as an example of how one case could reshape an entire field. But Rose wasn't interested in the legal precedents. She wanted to know about the people. She'd managed to track down Judge Theodore Brennan, now 83 and long retired, living in a small house on the same street where he'd once sheltered a widow and her son. When she knocked on his door on a crisp October afternoon, he answered with the careful movements of age but eyes that were still sharp and assessing. "Miss Chen, come in, come in. I made coffee." The house still smelled like old wood and furniture polish, but the walls were covered with photographs now. Grandchildren, great-grandchildren, a whole lifetime of accumulated family. But prominently displayed on the mantel was a child's crayon drawing in a simple frame. The colors faded, but the stick figures still visible under their smiling sun. "That's the famous drawing," Rose said, drawn to it immediately. "One of them," Brennan replied, settling into his armchair with a grunt. "Danny made me dozens over the years. That was the first. I've read all the court transcripts, all the news coverage. But I wanted to ask you, looking back, do you think you made the right decision? Admitting your mistake publicly, ruling against precedent, putting your career at risk." Brennan was quiet for a long moment, his gnarled fingers wrapped around his coffee mug. "The right decision? I don't know. But it was the honest decision, and sometimes that's all we have. You were censured by the Judicial Review Board. You could have lost everything. I did lose things. My reputation for a while, some friendships, the confidence that I knew what I was doing." He smiled faintly. "But I gained something more important, the knowledge that I'd finally kept faith with Michael Holloway, even if it was 23 years too late." "What happened to Margaret and Danny? The records stop after the trial." "Margaret went back to school, became a social worker specializing in housing advocacy. She spent 30 years helping families navigate the system, making sure what happened to her didn't happen to others." Brennan's voice softened. "She passed away 2 years ago, cancer, but she lived long enough to see her son graduate law school." Rose's eyes widened. "Danny Holloway became a lawyer? Passed the Kansas bar on his first try. He's a public defender now, works in juvenile court, spends his days making sure kids with difficult backgrounds get fair treatment, real chances. Brennan gestured to a photograph on the side table. A man in his 30s with dark hair and serious eyes, standing next to an elderly judge. That was taken at his swearing-in ceremony. He asked me to be there. So the drawing was prophetic. You really did save him. No. Brennan's voice was firm. Margaret saved him. She taught him that fighting for what's right matters more than taking the easy path. She taught him that justice isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose to create. He paused. I just happened to be there when she needed someone to stand with her instead of against her. Rose made notes, but her next question came from genuine curiosity rather than academic research. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if she hadn't brought that drawing to court? If you hadn't recognized the name? Every day for 20 years. Brennan set down his coffee. But here's what I learned, Miss Chen. We spend too much time wondering about the moments that change our lives, and not enough time recognizing that every moment is a potential turning point. Every person who walks into that courtroom is someone's son or daughter, someone's mother or father. Every case is a chance to choose between easy precedent and hard justice. That's not how they teach it in law school. No, it's not. Because that kind of justice is messy and personal and can't be reduced to a formula. But it's the only kind that actually matters. He leaned forward. You want to know the real legacy of the Holloway case? It's not the act they passed, though that's helped thousands of families. It's not the changes to housing law, though those are important. Then what is it? It's Danny Holloway standing in front of a judge today, arguing for a scared teenager who made a mistake, and knowing that second chances aren't just legal concepts. They're lifelines. It's every social worker who fights a little harder because Margaret showed them it's possible. It's every judge who remembers that the person in front of them is human, not just a case number. Brennan's voice grew thick. It's the fact that Michael Holloway's death, which felt like such a senseless waste, ended up saving lives he never knew existed. That's what redemption looks like. Rose stayed for 2 more hours, listening to stories that would never make it into law journals, but mattered more than any legal precedent. When she finally stood to leave, Brennan walked her to the door with slow, careful steps. One more question, Rose said. Do you have any regrets? Brennan looked back at the crayon drawing on the mantel, at the photographs of the life he'd built after scandal and censure and public judgment. I regret that I didn't do better by Michael Holloway when he needed me. I regret that it took me 23 years to find my courage. But do I regret the choice I made in that courtroom? He smiled. Not for a single second. After Rose left, Theodore Brennan stood at his window, watching the autumn leaves drift down from the maple tree in his front yard. He thought about Margaret, whose funeral he'd attended with tears streaming down his face. He thought about Michael, whom he'd failed and somehow, circuitously, honored. He thought about Danny, now carrying forward the work of justice into another generation. And he thought about all the moments in a life when you stand at a crossroads, when you can choose the safe path or the right path, when you can follow the rules or follow your conscience, when you can see a person as a problem or as a human being worth fighting for. In the end, we're all just trying to do better than we did yesterday. Some of us get there, some of us don't. But the trying, the daily choice to show up and do the hard work of caring, that's what transforms tragedy into legacy, failure into redemption, grief into grace. The epilogue to the Holloway case lives on in whispered courthouse legends. They say if you look closely at the brass plaque on the lobby wall on certain winter mornings, you can see a reflection of three figures holding hands: a judge, a widow, and a child, walking toward a future none of them could have imagined. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories of courage, justice, and the moments that change everything. Because every one of us has the power to be the person who says enough, the person who stands up when it matters most.